The moment she tore apart that little notebook, she thought she was humiliating a waitress. She had no idea she was destroying the one thing that held years of sacrifice, heartbreak, and a secret no one in that restaurant was prepared to hear. The crystal chandeliers of Sterling House reflected across polished marble floors, casting soft golden light over one of Manhattan's most exclusive dining rooms. Silverware gleamed. Wine glasses sparkled. Conversations about mergers, investments, and private jets floated through the air like background music. It was a place where people measured success in millions of dollars and rarely looked twice at the people serving their meals. Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables carrying a tray of sparkling water. At 27, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Her black uniform was simple. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her expression remained calm even when demanding guests snapped their fingers or complained about things most people would never notice. She smiled politely. She listened carefully. And she never argued. Tucked inside the pocket of her apron was a small blue notebook. The edges were worn from years of use. The cover had faded long ago. Every spare moment she had, Claire opened it and wrote. Sometimes during lunch breaks. Sometimes while waiting for coffee orders. Sometimes after midnight when her shift finally ended and the city lights reflected across the subway windows on her ride home. Nobody paid much attention to it. Most assumed it was a server's order book. Most assumed wrong. Claire was placing fresh coffee beside a couple near the fireplace when the front doors opened. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Heads turned. Conversations softened. Even the restaurant manager straightened his tie. Richard Sterling had arrived. The billionaire investor was known across Wall Street for turning struggling companies into empires. At 52, his silver-streaked hair and tailored navy suit carried the effortless confidence of a man who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted. But tonight, it was not Richard who captured everyone's attention. It was the woman walking beside him. Victoria Sterling entered the restaurant as though she owned every square foot of it. Diamonds shimmered at her wrist. Her designer handbag rested casually on one arm. Her smile looked perfect from a distance, but anyone paying attention could see something colder beneath it. Victoria enjoyed being admired. More importantly, she enjoyed being feared. The hostess greeted them immediately. Managers appeared from nowhere. Staff members exchanged nervous glances. Claire simply picked up her tray and continued working. She had served powerful people before. Politicians, celebrities, CEOs. They all ordered dinner the same way. Victoria noticed her almost immediately. Her eyes drifted toward Claire's apron as the waitress stepped past their table carrying menus for another guest. For a brief moment, Victoria saw the small blue notebook sticking out from Claire's pocket. Her gaze lingered. Then a faint smile appeared. Not a kind smile. The kind that usually meant trouble was coming. 40 minutes later, the restaurant was buzzing with energy. Richard's business associates had arrived. Investors filled the long private table near the center of the room. Champagne flowed. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Claire approached with another tray of drinks. As she leaned forward to place a glass beside one of the guests, the notebook slipped from her pocket. It landed softly near Victoria's chair. Claire immediately crouched down. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Let me get that." But Victoria was faster. She picked up the notebook before Claire could reach it. Her perfectly manicured fingers turned it over curiously. "Well," she said loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. "What do we have here?" Claire stood slowly. Her face remained calm, but something flickered behind her eyes. "It's mine," she said politely. "May I have it back, please?" Victoria ignored the request. She opened the notebook. Her smile widened. And then, in front of one of the most powerful tables in Manhattan, she laughed. The laughter spread quickly across the table. A few guests smiled into their wine glasses. Others exchanged amused looks, eager for a moment of entertainment. Between discussions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Victoria flipped through the notebook as though she were examining something she had found on the sidewalk. "Interesting," she said. "Very interesting." Claire remained standing beside the table. Her hands stayed folded neatly in front of her apron. Only Richard noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. Victoria turned another page. Her eyebrows rose dramatically. "What exactly am I looking at?" she asked. "Shopping lists? Random doodles? Secret recipes?" More laughter followed. Claire's voice remained soft. "It is personal, ma'am. Personal. Victoria repeated. That sounds important. She held the notebook higher. Then perhaps you should not leave it lying around where educated people can find it. Several investors chuckled. One man adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, curious to see what had captured Victoria's attention. Claire could feel dozens of eyes on her. The room suddenly seemed quieter. The clinking of silverware faded into the background. Even servers moving between tables slowed slightly, sensing something uncomfortable unfolding. Victoria stopped on one page filled with neat handwritten notes. Columns of words. Sentences. Observations. Her smile sharpened. Well now, this is adorable. She glanced toward the guests. I think our waitress is trying very hard to be intellectual. Another wave of laughter rolled across the table. Claire lowered her gaze briefly. Not from shame. From restraint. She had spent years learning how to remain calm when people assumed they knew her story. Years learning that dignity often meant saying nothing at all. Victoria flipped another page. Tell me, Claire, did you actually write all of this? Yes, ma'am. Yourself? Yes. Victoria laughed again. That is impressive. Her tone suggested the opposite. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. Something about the exchange felt increasingly uncomfortable. He had attended enough charity galas and board meetings to recognize when teasing crossed into humiliation. Yet before he could speak, Victoria continued. You know what fascinates me, she said. People pretending to be something they are not. The words landed heavily. Claire said nothing. Across the dining room, an older gentleman seated alone near the windows glanced up from his meal. He had been quietly observing the interaction for several minutes. Now his attention remained fixed on the notebook. Victoria turned another page. Her expression changed slightly. Just for a moment. A flicker of confusion crossed her face before disappearing. The handwriting was unusually precise. The notes organized. References filled the margins. Symbols and translations appeared beside certain entries. She did not fully understand what she was reading, but she refused to let uncertainty interrupt the performance she had already begun. Let us be honest, Victoria said. Most people working in restaurants are not exactly spending their evenings studying philosophy. A few guests nodded politely. Richard remained silent. Claire finally looked directly at Victoria. Her blue eyes stayed calm, steady, unshaken. May I please have my notebook back? She asked. Victoria ignored the request. Instead, she looked toward the guests. What do you think? She asked playfully. Should we test her? More smiles appeared around the table. What had begun as casual mockery was turning into a game. Claire felt the familiar weight of memory pressing against her chest. Long nights. Hospital waiting rooms. Textbooks balanced beside medical bills. Years of sacrifice compressed into the pages Victoria now held carelessly between manicured fingers. Every note represented a piece of her life. Every page carried something she could never replace. The older gentleman near the window slowly set down his coffee cup. His expression had changed completely. Recognition flickered in his eyes. Not recognition of Claire herself. Recognition of the notebook's contents. Meanwhile, Victoria stood from her chair. The diamonds at her wrist caught the chandelier light. She smiled broadly, as though preparing the evening's main attraction. I have an idea, she announced. The conversations around the room began to fade. Guests turned toward her. Staff paused discreetly. Even Richard looked up. Victoria held open one page of the notebook and glanced toward Claire. Since this appears to be such a valuable piece of writing, she said, her voice carrying across the dining room, perhaps you can explain it to all of us. A silence settled over the restaurant. The kind of silence that arrives just before everything changes. Claire could feel every eye in the restaurant settling on her. The silence that followed Victoria's announcement seemed to stretch across the room like a drawn curtain. Somewhere near the bar, a glass touched a tabletop with a soft click. Then even that sound disappeared. Victoria smiled as though she had just created the evening's entertainment. Come on, she said lightly. You wrote it. Surely you can explain it. A few guests laughed politely. Others shifted in their seats, sensing the situation was becoming uncomfortable. Claire glanced at the notebook. Her notebook. Years of notes, translations, observations, and personal reflections rested in someone else's hands. Yet her expression remained calm. I would prefer not to discuss private writings during your dinner, ma'am, she said. Victoria tilted her head. Private? She looked around the table. That makes it sound even more interesting. Another ripple of amusement moved through the guests. Richard Sterling slowly set down his fork. He had spent most of his career reading people. Negotiating billion-dollar deals required understanding what others hid beneath their words. And there was something unusual about Claire Bennett. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look intimidated. If anything, she looked concerned for the notebook itself. "Victoria," Richard said quietly, "perhaps we should let her return to work." But Victoria barely acknowledged him. Her attention remained fixed on Claire. "Tell me," she continued, "what exactly is in here?" She turned another page. Her smile faded slightly. More foreign phrases appeared. Detailed notes. Cross-references. Handwritten observations in multiple columns. None of it looked random. None of it looked like the scribbles of someone pretending to be intelligent. Victoria quickly masked her uncertainty. "Well?" she asked. Claire hesitated. Not because she feared speaking. Because she knew what came. Next, people often became uncomfortable when assumptions collided with reality. "They are language notes," she finally said. A few eyebrows lifted around the table. Victoria laughed. "Language notes?" "Yes." "What kind of language notes?" Claire answered simply. "Several languages." The room grew slightly quieter. Richard looked up. One of the European investors stopped scrolling through his phone. Even the older gentleman near the window leaned forward. Victoria crossed her arms. "Several languages?" she repeated. "How many exactly?" Claire thought for a moment. "Enough to keep me busy." A few guests exchanged surprised glances. The answer was calm, polite, yet somehow it shifted the atmosphere. Victoria noticed it too. She immediately pushed harder. "Then perhaps you can prove it." Claire remained silent. Victoria opened to a page near the center of the notebook. Her eyes moved across the handwriting. Most of it meant nothing to her. But one section contained a block of text she recognized as French. She smiled again. There it was. An opportunity. "Perfect," she announced. "Let us try something simple." She turned the notebook outward. "Read this." Claire looked at the page. Her stomach tightened slightly. Not because she could not read it. Because she knew exactly where the passage came from. The notes were not casual translations. They came from advanced legal language studies she had completed years earlier. Across the room, the older gentleman's expression changed again. Recognition deepened into certainty. He knew that text. He knew the source. And suddenly, for the first time that evening, he looked far more interested in Claire Bennett than in the expensive dinner sitting untouched in front of him. Claire looked at the open notebook for several long seconds. The page facing her contained dense handwritten notes in French. Legal terminology. Contract structures, comparative translations, the kind of material most people would never encounter outside specialized academic or corporate environments. Victoria smiled confidently. She was certain she had cornered her. After all, what were the chances that a waitress carrying plates across a dining room could explain pages filled with foreign legal language? Around the table, several investors leaned forward with growing curiosity. One man loosened his tie. Another quietly set down his wine glass. The atmosphere had shifted from amusement to anticipation. Claire finally lifted her eyes. "Would you like me to read it?" she asked. Victoria laughed lightly. "That would be a wonderful start." The room fell silent again. Claire glanced at the page one last time. Then she began speaking. The French flowed effortlessly. Clear. Precise. Every word carried the confidence of someone who understood not only the language itself, but the meaning behind it. Several European guests immediately straightened in their chairs. One investor from Paris blinked in surprise. Another slowly lowered his fork halfway to his plate and forgot to move it again. Victoria's smile remained frozen. Richard felt a strange sensation of disbelief building inside him. He had expected hesitation, confusion, embarrassment. Instead, Claire sounded exactly like someone delivering a professional translation. She finished the passage and calmly looked up. Nobody spoke. For a brief moment, the restaurant seemed completely still. Then the investor from Paris broke the silence. "That was accurate," he said quietly. "Very accurate." His words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Small reactions spread throughout the room. A few guests exchanged glances. Others looked back toward Claire with entirely different expressions than before. Victoria quickly recovered. "Well," she said, forcing a smile. "Perhaps you memorized a few phrases." Claire said nothing. The older gentleman near the window slowly stood from his table. His chair slid softly across the floor. Several people turned toward him. He approached with measured steps, carrying himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "That was not memorization," he said. His voice was gentle but firm. "The terminology she used requires contextual understanding." Victoria frowned slightly. "And you are?" "Professor Harold Whitmore." A few guests immediately recognized the name. Murmurs spread across nearby tables. Columbia University. International linguistics. Published author. Consultant to several multinational organizations. Richard's eyebrows rose. Even he knew the reputation. Professor Whitmore looked directly at Claire. Recognition filled his eyes now. Not uncertainty. Not curiosity. Recognition. "I thought I recognized the handwriting," he said softly. Claire looked genuinely surprised. "Professor Whitmore." Victoria glanced between them. Her confidence began to weaken. "You know each other?" The professor nodded. "Years ago." He looked back toward the notebook. "These notes are not beginner exercises." The room remained completely silent. "In fact," he continued, "some of them are advanced comparative language studies that very few graduate students successfully complete." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. The laughter from earlier suddenly felt very distant. Victoria tightened her grip on the notebook. Richard could see uncertainty spreading across her face for the first time that evening. Yet before anyone could say another word, movement at the far end of the table caught Claire's attention. A thick business document had slipped partially from one of the investors' folders. The top page was visible, just enough for her eyes to catch a familiar phrase written in French legal language. Her expression changed. Only slightly. Most people would not have noticed it. Richard did. And something told him the evening was far from over. Claire's eyes remained fixed on the document protruding from the investor's folder. It lasted only a second. A brief glance. The kind most people would never notice. But something in the text had caught her attention immediately. Professor Whitmore followed her gaze. He noticed the change in her expression. Richard noticed it too. Victoria, however, was too focused on recovering control of the situation. The confidence she had carried into the evening was beginning to crack, and she was determined not to let anyone see it. "Well," she said sharply, forcing a laugh. "This has certainly become more dramatic than I expected." Nobody laughed with her this time. The silence felt different now. Earlier, people had been watching a waitress. Now they were watching a mystery. Victoria held the notebook against her side. "I suppose we have established that Claire knows some French." Professor Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "Some French." His voice remained calm. "I would estimate advanced professional fluency." Several guests exchanged glances. Victoria's jaw tightened. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. He had spent years evaluating expertise. One thing had become very clear. Claire Bennett was hiding far more than anyone had imagined. At that moment, one of the investors reached for the folder beside him. The document slipped further onto the table. Claire immediately looked away. She had no intention of intruding. Yet the phrase she had seen remained fixed in her mind. A specific clause. A specific translation. A specific problem. The investor noticed her glance and casually pulled the folder closer. "Everything all right?" Richard asked. Claire hesitated. "Yes, sir." Her answer came too quickly. Richard noticed. So did Professor Whitmore. The older professor studied her carefully. "Claire," he asked gently, "did you recognize something?" Every eye turned toward her. Claire immediately shook her head. "It is not my place." Richard folded his hands together. "What is not your place?" Claire glanced toward the folder again. "Your business discussions." Victoria finally found an opening. "Exactly," she said, "which is why perhaps we should return to them." But Richard was no longer interested in returning to dinner. Curiosity had replaced irritation. "Claire," he said, "if you notice something, I would rather hear it." She remained silent. The room waited. A waiter carrying a tray stopped several feet away. Nearby conversations faded. Even guests at other tables were beginning to sense something unusual unfolding. Claire looked down briefly, then back toward Richard. "I only saw one sentence." "And?" Richard asked. "It may be nothing. And if it is not?" Claire exhaled slowly. Years of experience had taught her that people rarely welcomed correction, especially from someone wearing a server's uniform. Yet she also knew what she had read. Finally she spoke. "The French clause appears to grant operational authority under a broader definition than the English translation suggests." The investor holding the folder frowned immediately. "That is impossible." Claire nodded respectfully. "It may be, I only saw part of the page. Richard's expression darkened slightly. Not with anger. With concern. He turned toward the investor. May I see the document? The man hesitated. Then he slowly slid the folder across the table. Several executives leaned closer. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Professor Whitmore watched silently. Richard opened the folder. His eyes moved across the page, then to the translated version attached behind it. His expression changed. Just slightly, but enough for everyone to notice. The room grew even quieter. A clock somewhere near the reception desk ticked softly. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Richard read the paragraph again. Then he looked up at Claire. For the first time that evening, the billionaire's confidence seemed unsettled. How much of that sentence did you actually see? He asked quietly. Claire looked at him calmly. About 12 words. Nobody spoke. Because somehow, after reading only 12 words from a passing document, the waitress everyone had underestimated appeared to know something that a room full of executives had completely missed. The question lingered in the air long after Richard finished speaking. Claire stood quietly beside the table while dozens of eyes remained fixed on her. 12 words. That was all she had seen. 12 words buried inside a contract prepared by attorneys, consultants, and executives whose combined hourly rates could have funded a small business for an entire year. Yet Richard's expression suggested she had touched something important. The investor who owned the folder shifted uncomfortably in his chair. There is no way she could know the full context, he said. His voice sounded less confident than before. Richard continued studying the document. He read the French clause again, then the English translation, then the French version once more. A faint crease appeared between his eyebrows. Across the table, several executives leaned closer. One asked to see the page. Another adjusted his glasses and silently compared the two versions. The room had transformed completely. An hour earlier, Claire had been invisible. Now some of the most influential people in the restaurant were examining a contract because of a waitress's observation. Victoria felt the change more than anyone. She sat perfectly still, clutching the blue notebook on her lap. The attention had shifted away from her. Worse, it had shifted toward Claire. Professor Whitmore folded his hands and watched quietly. He recognized the look on Richard's face. It was the expression of a man discovering an unexpected problem. Finally, Richard looked up. The operational authority language is broader in the French version, he said slowly. No one spoke. One executive immediately reached for the document. Another asked for a copy. The investor who had brought the contract suddenly appeared much less comfortable than when the evening began. Claire remained silent. She did not smile. She did not look satisfied. She simply stood there holding an empty serving tray. Richard turned toward her again. How did you catch that? Claire hesitated. Because the wording is unusual. Unusual how? She glanced toward the document. Most translators focus on direct equivalence. That phrase requires contextual interpretation. The legal meaning changes depending on how authority is defined in adjacent sections. Several people at the table stared at her. One executive blinked twice. Another slowly lowered his wine glass. Professor Whitmore allowed himself the faintest smile. Richard looked genuinely astonished. You understood all of that from a brief glance. Claire nodded slightly. I have seen similar structures before. The answer raised more questions than it solved. Victoria could feel the evening slipping beyond her control. This is ridiculous, she said suddenly. Her voice cut through the silence. We are treating a waitress like she is some kind of legal expert. No one immediately agreed. That realization unsettled her even more. Richard looked at her briefly, then back at Claire. Have you studied law? Claire shook her head. No. Then where did you learn this? The question hung in the air. Claire looked toward the notebook still resting in Victoria's hands. Years of memories sat between them. Long nights studying after work. Hospital visits. Scholarships she never used. Opportunities she had quietly sacrificed. For a moment, sadness crossed her face. Then it disappeared. Life teaches many things, she said softly. The answer was simple. Yet somehow it carried more weight than a detailed explanation ever could. Around the dining room, people who had laughed earlier now looked at her differently. Not because of what she knew, because of how little she seemed to need credit for knowing it. Richard slowly closed the contract folder. The problem inside it was real. He could see that now. But another realization was beginning to settle over him. The most remarkable discovery of the evening was not hidden inside a business agreement. It was standing beside the table in a black server's uniform, asking for nothing while revealing more intelligence than anyone had expected. The dining room remained unusually quiet. Even the background music seemed distant now. Richard Sterling looked at Claire with growing curiosity, while the executives around him exchanged careful glances. The contract issue had transformed the evening. What had started as entertainment at someone else's expense had become something none of them expected. Victoria felt it more than anyone. The balance of attention had shifted completely. Earlier, people had laughed when she mocked a waitress. Now they were listening when that same waitress spoke. She looked down at the blue notebook still resting in her hands. Suddenly it felt heavier than before. Professor Whitmore stepped closer. "May I see it?" he asked politely. Victoria hesitated before handing it over. The professor opened several pages and slowly turned through them. His eyes moved across handwritten notes, translations, annotations, and observations collected over years. Occasionally he nodded to himself. Occasionally he paused longer at a page. Finally he looked up. "Remarkable." One of the executives leaned forward. "What exactly is it?" Professor Whitmore smiled faintly. "Discipline." The answer confused several people. He continued. "Most people think intelligence appears suddenly. It does not. It is built one page at a time." His fingers rested gently on the notebook. "These notes represent thousands of hours of work." Claire lowered her eyes. She never enjoyed being the center of attention. The notebook had always been private. A place where she organized thoughts during difficult years. A place where she continued learning when life forced her onto a different path. Richard noticed the sadness behind her calm expression. "How long have you been studying languages?" he asked. Claire considered the question. "Since I was 16. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. 16? One investor repeated. Claire nodded. "I liked understanding how people think. Languages help with that." Professor Whitmore smiled. "That sounds exactly like something one of my best students would have said." The room became still again. Victoria looked sharply toward him. "One of your students?" The professor met her gaze calmly. "Yes." For the first time all evening, genuine surprise crossed the room. Richard straightened in his chair. "Claire studied under you?" "Years ago." Professor Whitmore closed the notebook carefully. "She was among the most promising students I ever taught." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Several executives stared openly. One guest actually removed his glasses and cleaned them as though he had misheard. Richard looked at Claire. "Why did you leave?" It was a simple question, yet it carried more weight than any question asked that evening. Claire remained quiet for several seconds. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her serving tray. "My younger brother became ill," she said softly. "Medical treatments were expensive. Someone had to work." No one spoke. The answer contained no bitterness, no self-pity, just truth. Professor Whitmore nodded. "She disappeared from the program almost overnight." His voice carried genuine respect. "Many of us hoped she would return." Victoria looked away. For the first time since arriving, she had nothing to say. Richard glanced around the table. The investors who had laughed earlier now appeared uncomfortable. The contrast was impossible to ignore. They had judged a woman without knowing her story, judged her education without knowing her sacrifices, judged her worth because of a uniform. And somehow Claire had never once raised her voice. She had never argued. She had never demanded respect. Yet respect was exactly what she had earned. Then Richard noticed something else. The notebook. Several pages near the center appeared worn more than the others. Tucked between them was a folded document. Old. Carefully preserved. He looked at Claire. "What is that?" he asked quietly. Claire's expression changed immediately. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely nervous. Claire's eyes immediately moved toward the folded paper tucked between the worn pages. The confidence that had carried her through the evening seemed to falter for the first time. Not dramatically, just enough for those paying attention to notice. Richard saw it. Professor Whitmore saw it. Even Victoria noticed the change. The billionaire leaned forward slightly. "I apologize if it is personal," he said. "You do not have to answer." Claire remained silent for a moment. The dining room waited. Then she offered a small nod. "It is all right." Professor Whitmore carefully opened the notebook to the page where the document rested. The paper was old. The edges had yellowed with time. It had been folded and unfolded countless times over the years. Whatever it was, someone had carried it for a very long time. Richard watched as the professor removed it gently and handed it to Claire. She stared at it for several seconds before opening it. A faint smile appeared. Not a happy smile. The kind people wear when remembering a life they once imagined. What is it? Richard asked quietly. Claire looked down at the page. An acceptance letter. The room became still. She continued. A full academic fellowship. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Professor Whitmore nodded slowly. He already knew what the letter was. Richard waited. Claire took a breath. I received it 8 years ago. Her fingers traced the corner of the paper. It would have covered everything. Tuition, research, travel opportunities. One executive asked softly. Then why did you not use it? Claire smiled sadly. Because my brother needed me more. No one spoke. The answer landed gently, yet somehow carried more weight than anything said that evening. The chandeliers continued glowing overhead. Glasses still sat on white tablecloths. Expensive watches still reflected the light. Yet none of those things seemed important anymore. Claire folded the letter carefully. My brother was 14. His treatments became more expensive every month. She looked toward the notebook. I kept studying whenever I could. During breaks. On trains. After work. But life moved in a different direction. Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Across the table, several investors lowered their eyes. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Earlier they had laughed at a waitress carrying a notebook. Now they were looking at years of sacrifice quietly hidden behind a uniform. Professor Whitmore spoke gently. She never stopped learning. He gestured toward the notebook. That much is obvious. Claire laughed softly. Some habits are difficult to lose. A few guests smiled. Not because the situation was amusing. Because her humility made everything more remarkable. Victoria sat completely silent. The blue notebook that had seemed ridiculous an hour earlier now felt like evidence of something she had failed to understand. Richard looked at Claire for a long moment. Then he asked a question nobody expected. Is your brother doing well now? Claire's expression softened instantly. Genuine warmth appeared in her eyes. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Very well. Relief seemed to move through the room. Claire nodded. He graduated last spring. A few guests smiled openly. Professor Whitmore smiled too. Yet Richard noticed something else. Beneath the acceptance letter was another folded sheet of paper. Newer. Different. Claire quickly slid it back into the notebook before anyone could see much of it. But Richard caught a glimpse of an unfamiliar corporate logo at the top of the page. His curiosity returned immediately, because whatever story the acceptance letter told, it was clear there was still another chapter hidden inside that notebook. And judging by Claire's reaction, that chapter might explain even more than the one they had just heard. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the notebook. The glimpse had lasted less than a second, yet it was enough to spark another question. The corporate logo he had seen looked familiar. Very familiar. Claire carefully closed the notebook and held it against her chest. The protective gesture did not go unnoticed. Around the table, the executives who had spent their careers analyzing negotiations and hidden motives immediately recognized it. Whatever that document was, it mattered to her. Richard spoke gently. I am sorry if I am being intrusive. Claire offered a small smile. You are not. He nodded toward the notebook. Was that another acceptance letter? Claire hesitated. Then she shook her head. No. The room remained quiet. What was it? Richard asked. Claire looked down at the worn cover for a moment before answering. A job offer. Several people exchanged surprised glances. Richard leaned forward. Recently. Claire nodded. About 6 months ago. And you turned it down? Again she nodded. The billionaire looked genuinely confused. May I ask why? Claire laughed softly. Because life is complicated. A few guests smiled. Yet nobody missed the sadness hidden beneath her words. Professor Whitmore adjusted his glasses. Who made the offer? Claire hesitated. Then she slowly opened the notebook and removed the folded paper. She handed it to Richard. The moment he unfolded it, his expression changed. His eyes moved across the page. Then he looked up at her. Then back at the page again. The executives nearest him immediately noticed. What is it? One asked. Richard did not answer immediately. He simply handed the letter across the table. One by one, several executives read it. Each reacted the same way. Surprise. Disbelief. Silence. Finally, Victoria could no longer contain her curiosity. What does it say? She asked. Richard looked directly at her. It is an offer from Sterling Global. Victoria blinked. The room became still. Richard continued. A senior international communications position. Nobody spoke. Claire stood quietly beside the table. Richard looked back at the letter. The offer carried an impressive salary, benefits, international travel, leadership opportunities. It was the kind of position thousands of qualified applicants would compete for. Why did you decline it? He asked softly. Claire smiled. Because my brother had just started college. Richard frowned slightly. I do not understand. He was finally doing well. He needed stability. I was helping him finish school. The answer landed gently. Yet somehow it silenced the room more effectively than any dramatic revelation could have. Claire looked around the dining room. A job can return. Opportunities can return. Certain moments with family do not. No one had a response to that. Victoria lowered her eyes. For the first time all evening, she seemed unable to meet Claire's gaze. Richard slowly stood from his chair. The movement immediately drew everyone's attention. The billionaire looked at Claire for a long moment. Then, in front of investors, executives, professors, restaurant staff, and guests, he spoke words nobody expected to hear. Claire Bennett, I owe you an apology. The dining room became completely silent. Richard glanced briefly toward the notebook, toward the acceptance letter, toward the pages filled with years of effort. Tonight, I watched a room full of successful people make assumptions about someone they did not know. His voice remained calm, myself included. Claire said nothing. Richard extended the notebook back toward her with both hands. A simple gesture, yet one filled with respect. Claire accepted it quietly. Across the room, several guests who had laughed earlier now looked embarrassed. Others looked thoughtful. Victoria slowly stood as well. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I am sorry, Claire. The words seemed difficult for her to say. Claire studied her for a moment. Then she smiled. Not triumphantly, not proudly, simply kindly. Thank you. That was all. No lecture. No revenge. No attempt to make anyone feel smaller. The simplicity of her response somehow carried the greatest power of all. Minutes later, conversations gradually returned. Glasses clinked again. Dinner resumed. Yet the atmosphere had changed completely. As Claire returned to serving tables, people no longer saw a waitress carrying trays through a crowded restaurant. They saw someone whose intelligence had never needed validation, whose sacrifices had never demanded recognition, and whose dignity remained intact even when others failed to see it. And long after the evening ended, many people would remember a lesson that no contract, investment, or business deal could teach them. A uniform may tell you what a person does for a living, but it tells you absolutely nothing about who they are.